WSHO Sunshine 800 AM. Luke Walker once again with you here. Glad you joined us. Glad you tuned in for today. We got a special guest with us on the line, Dr. WILFRED Reilly. WILFRED, are you there with us?
Yeah, I'm right here.
Wonderful. Sounds great. Dr. WILFRED Reilly is the assistant professor of political science, criminal justice at the School of Government Policy and Justice Studies at Kentucky State University. Last week we talked about his book Taboo. We're actually going to talk with him a little bit more about that. But Dr. Reilly, thank you so much for joining us. I want to jump right in to just kind of an open-ended question. Listening to your books, the person who's reading your books, obviously I don't think it's you, but I think they embody a little bit of how you write. They've done that really well with the audio versions. It seems like we're more racist than ever all of a sudden in the United States of America. Why are we not so racist right now?
I mean, I think it was Charles Barkley that had a good line about this, where he said, I mean, you have to understand, there's not more violence between whites and blacks today than there was during the 68 riots. People just have cell phones. I mean, the claim that America is more racist than ever before is just nonsensical. I mean, so when we talk about rates of racism or whatever, in political science, there are actually a lot of questions that people have been asking for about 20 years to measure that. Oh, actually more than that, about 60 years. But I mean, you put someone in a totally anonymous room, there's no one writing down their name. This is often done with sort of a paper ballot, and you just ask them questions like, would you have any issues working, again, anonymously, for a black man, for example? Would you have any issues dating someone of a different race, or, kissing them, falling in love with them? Would you have any problem having neighbors of a different race, black if you're white, maybe Hispanic if you're black, so on down the line? And what we find is that on these actual studies, the percentage of people that are racist has been declining as long as we've been doing the studies. Right now, the percentage of whites that say they wouldn't vote for a well-qualified black guy for president and from their own political party and all that is about 7%. You find a similar level of racism among African Americans. Hispanics are even less racist. So in practice, we know that people are far less racist than they used to be. I mean, when you did those studies during the 1960s, I mean, the percentage of people of all races that said they wouldn't even want neighbors of a different race, I mean, that's something like 40%, 50%. So I think what you're seeing right now is a really intense focus by the media specifically. And I think the mass media has a lot to answer for in terms of this racial conflict in the country. But no, you're not seeing more racism. I mean, if you look at just marriages or relationships, last year I think it was 24% of marriages were mixed. So, I mean, obviously, if you're marrying someone who's African American or Asian American and you yourself are a Caucasian person, I mean, you might have some residual things, but it's really difficult to call you an old school bigot. So the issue isn't so much that we're seeing more racists. And I mean, think about that. The Civil War, the Civil Rights Movement. I mean, the issue is that there's more focus on the fairly small amount of racism that's left. And I think you've got a question there. But if you look at, African Americans getting shot by the police, the total number of unarmed brothers that were killed by cops last year was 15. The issue is that every one of those cases, because we now know what attracts those clicks, what gets that anger, every one of those cases is going to be a national news story.
So now we understand that there has to be a certain amount of anger in order to mobilize voting blocks, to motivate entire bases of parties, like national turnouts. If you disagree with this, just let me know. But national turnout in a national elections, typically the person who wins has the most mobilized base. You need to turn your base out, right?
Mm-hmm.
So is this sudden explosion in 2020 coming off the back of COVID-19 and all of us being locked up, is this just sort of a perfect storm in an election year to where this feels like it's been building for years, but in reality, it's just kind of this present circumstances that we see, and it's a crisis, like Rahm Emanuel said, it's a crisis that they're not letting go to waste?
I think that there's probably some truth to it. I mean, I'm not a conspiracy theory head.
Correct.
And I've never studied this. But I'd be really interested in seeing, how donations to Black Lives Matter or to the Boogaloo type groups on the hard right, what happens to those in election years. And I wouldn't be surprised if they spike. And I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of that money comes from people on the other side that are kind of trying to stir up anger from their opponent's sort of most visible base. So, I mean, yeah, a lot of the focus on some of the things that BLM was doing. I mean, if you think of the years when there was really fighting in the streets. I mean, you had 2016 with the Trump rallies. That was an election year. You had 2014 with Ferguson. That was the big congressional election year the past 8-10 years. I mean, obviously, for people to be fighting in the streets, there do have to be underlying issues. But are there people that would actually be more inclined to incite that kind of thing if their candidate was running for president? I mean, yeah, there clearly are. I mean, I was a canvass director for years for a group called the Fund for the Public Interest, which obviously doesn't do this kind of in the streets direct action, but which would send people door to door to raise money, round up signatures, so on for political candidates when big elections were coming up. And I mean, this is an organized enterprise. Like the people you see standing on the street canvassing in big cities like Chicago and New Orleans are volunteers generally. They make about $15 an hour. Our office was based on the south side of Chicago. We would send people around the city in support of generally Democratic candidates or causes like gay rights. And the people that are doing that at a more grassroots street level, I mean, clearly have an interest in doing some things to get their candidate elected. Whether or not you want to link it directly to presidential elections, I mean, one thing I would say, again, is there obviously is an element of people bluntly exaggerating problems like racism on all sides in the USA in order to create headlines, in order to create news. So the figure I just gave there, I want to repeat, like the total number of unarmed black men killed by cops in 2019 was 15. And that's extremely typical. In a typical year, it's between 10 and 20. So, I mean, the reason that we think of this as a national crisis is that there's a very effective activist organization. That's the actual incorporated Black Lives Matter led by Patrisse Cullors that feeds every one of those cases into a social media network that's now at about 2 million people, knowing that they're going to be picked up by the media and publicized. And this is true for a lot of things. I mean, you see the hard right doing this. I mean, like if you go on the internet, you see all these videos, Twitter and so on, of, for example, black guys attacking white guys. And the right wing would argue, well, no, the real epidemic isn't, white on black crime. It's black on white crime. That's also not true. I mean, if you look at how crime actually works, the person most likely to kill you is your wife, specifically your ex-wife.
Right.
But I mean, it's your ex-wife or your current husband. It's not even close. But I mean, it's 93% of murders in the black community are committed by other black men. I mean, that's something we have to deal with in the black community. With Hispanics and working class whites, it's the same thing. I mean, 85% of murders of whites are committed by other whites. So black on white crime is not an epidemic problem. White on black crime is not an epidemic problem. Certainly the police killing people, that is not a major problem in the United States of America. I mean, in a typical year, they're going to be less than, say, 1,500 fatal or serious injury police shootings. The number of those involving unarmed people of every race is going to be maybe 50, 60. So, again, are there people that have an interest in taking what are really pretty rare phenomena, like white and black guy fight to the death, and publicizing those to make kind of a political point? Yes, that's why we see that stuff. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see it more during election years. I don't think that would exactly shock you either.
Not at all. And I think that you could even point to, as you just kind of just laid out, the idea that the worst sort of decisions amongst the between the races, let's just say, interracial murder, even that, when you look at the evidence, sort of bears out that we're not this racist, bigoted society.
Oh, yeah.
Which is just, quite amazing. Now, I want to kind of pivot because I keep the website that you link to on fake hate crimes or hate crime hoaxes. I keep that website and I refresh it pretty much a couple times a day, and I've seen it jump up about 10 over the last couple of weeks, which is, I guess now that I'm aware of the phenomenon, I'm just like, this is unbelievable. Like I did have the thought that like Jussie Smollett's case, where you have this incredibly successful actor on, at the time, maybe the biggest show on television, and that sort of fame isn't good enough for him, that he had to go out and fake a hate crime on multiple levels. I thought, wow, like that we're really beyond the issue of race, even more so than I thought, because that would like you have to fake a crime just to get a sort of fame. Like real fame is not good enough. The sort of fame that comes with being a victim of a hate crime is now gives you a greater clout on social media and within, I don't know what street cred, I don't know, but like talk a little bit, if you would, about your genesis into the fake hate crimes and sort of how you view that in terms of race relations.
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, the Jussie Smollett thing was the first thing that made me sort of mildly publicly famous. And I always shout out to Brother Jussie, thanks. But my first book is called Hate Crime Hoax, and it's an enjoyable book, but it's a bit academic. It looks at these hate crime hoaxes and why, people commit hoaxes. But the thing about that book, which pushed it onto the bestseller list, was that Hate Crime Hoax dropped like 2 days before the Jussie Smollett thing was revealed to be a hoax.
Wow.
So I was getting a lot of interviews. I do a lot of kind of center-right business media because that's my background, a lot of black media because I'm a black guy. And I wasn't getting hostile interviews, but in both those forums, people were asking, well, can you give a big example of this happening? I have, 100 in the book. But it was almost lucky for me in a dark sense that this occurred and this became very, very public. So whenever anyone was like, I don't believe you, I could just say, well, there's the Jussie Smollett case right now on the news. And Jussie Smollett, interestingly enough, is from like my neighborhood.
Okay.
I actually grew up kind of in the hood in Chicago. I was born on the south side. But that Streeterville neighborhood is the neighborhood pretty much every young professional moves to. I have buddies that live there now. I don't know if I ever had an apartment exactly there, but that's pretty close to where our canvas office was based. And I just mentioned all that stuff. So, while this was going on, as soon as I heard the story, I started thinking, well, that very likely didn't happen. That's an integrated big city neighborhood. It's probably 20% black, 15% gay. The idea of people walking, between the Irish bars and the florist boutiques and so on with, MAGA hats on, carrying a noose and a gallon bottle of bleach just seemed ridiculous. But yeah, the Jussie Smollett case obviously did turn out to be a fake. And the point of the book is that this isn't some kind of rare, isolated incident. If you look now, I want to say for ethical reasons that if you hear about kind of the standard hate crime, like someone claims they were jumped for racial reasons outside like a biker bar or a tough black club at 1 a.m., like that probably happened.
Right.
The response to that from the police shouldn't be kind of snark, like, well, I'm on the internet. What are the odds? Those cases almost invariably do occur. But when you look at the high-profile cases that have really helped define the racial debate in the USA, bluntly, I think we can say they were almost all fakes, or at least narrative collapses. You've got Jussie Smollett. You've got Covington Catholic. We saw this thing with Bubba Wallace just now. He's not a hoaxer, but definitely it is true. We now know that the quote-unquote noose in his garage was the gee rope they used to pull down the door.
Right.
Tied with an unfortunate knot, but we also see that it was 3 inches across. Like, there's no way you could have seriously thought this was, a pullback to the bad old days of lynching. There's Erica Thomas, the congresswoman who claimed she was attacked because of her race in a grocery store. And the guy she alleged attacked her actually came forward and said, I'm a left-wing Hispanic guy. This is all nonsense. He literally sort of photobombed her press conference to do that.
There was one in your book. No, there was one in your book. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. There were 15 or 20 of these. And this past week, as you mentioned, we've seen like 6.
Yeah, I think there was one where there was a letter or some hateful words that were pasted on a car that turned out to be the person who, again, reported the crime. I think there was a professor who wrote a letter that turned out to be they wrote the letter themselves. What does this say? Because you've looked at, I think this database is up to almost 400 of these dating back into like 10 years now. What does this say from a pathological standpoint? Like, what is the pathology of both whites and blacks? I don't know if you've ever broken down those 400 into what their demographics are, but is it mostly minorities making the case, or are there some? I know you have the Dolezal instance and some others, but like, what is the pathology behind the need? Because you mentioned the mental illness. What is the need to fake something in order to do what? To draw attention, or to cost people their jobs, cost millions of dollars, like in Missouri? Like what? What is that pathology?
Well, I mean, I think that that's a kind of great softball question. I mean, I think the motivation is just that we've really empowered victimization in the USA.
Golly.
So, I mean, traditionally, the American hero ideal, whether you're talking about blacks or whites, was, cowboys and, so on down the line, pioneers and, on the minority side, the great native warriors that fought them and so on. We've been a pretty macho country.
Right.
In recent years, we've kind of moved away from that. We've become for example, Americans take about, I think it's 2/3 of the psych meds in the world. We've become a very therapeuticized country. And there's a lot of social support for that. I mean, people make jokes about the idea your boss can't fire you if you're an alcoholic and so on, but that's pretty much accurate. So I think in something like a college campus setting where an incredible number of these hate incidents take place, I mean, if you go through the first 10 pages of that website, Fake Hate Crimes, I mean, I guarantee that more than a third of the cases, probably more than half, take place on a college campus. I mentioned that in Hoax. So we've created a situation where, especially in these sort of left-leaning academic environments, if you say you were a victim, that's going to translate not to anger, not to suggestions you talk to the police and otherwise keep this quiet, but to this incredible outpouring of sympathy. I mean, in many of the college campus hate crime cases I talk about in the book, like Oberlin, there were huge rallies on campus. There were editorials in the student newspaper. The police not only launched their own investigation, but brought in, for example, the feds. So if you are mentally unhealthy at a particular time for some reason and you need attention, you need support, you might very well get that from one of these incidents. I mean, after he made up what turned out to be a lie, Jussie Smollett was the lead guest on Good Morning America.
Right.
So I think there obviously are other motivations, insurance money and so on, but that's probably the big one. I mean, this sense of support, this sense that you'll be applauded for being a victim. And that's pretty deep psychologically, but it's very real.
The danger, though, in it to me seems that, like, for instance, I graduated high school in '95, so I was in college in those late '90s, graduated in 2000. I had the opportunity to play college basketball at a historical black college and university here. There would have been no chance of me going to any of the campus leadership and being like, "Hey, I'd like to create. I'd like a broom closet. I'd like a classroom. I'd like a space, and we want to call it the White Student Union." There would have been no chance of that. So now you have these identity groups. They've been there for the longest. You have all these different organizations that advocate on behalf of skin. Now we're told since the civil rights era, kind of the mantra of the civil rights era being content of character, not color of skin. We sort of arrived there as a country probably in the mid '90s, and it feels to me, being a high school kid in the mid '90s, it feels like race ain't a thing. I don't want to quote Lil Wayne, but when all these white kids show up to his rap event, I didn't know race was a thing anymore. Racism was a thing. That being said, how do we avoid getting to a place where you have white people kind of throwing their hands up and going, okay, if skin really is like the predominant thing, then like we're going to start advocating for ourselves. How did they not start adopting the rhetoric of the Jared Taylors and the Richard Spencers and us kind of reopening this great wound of American history?
That's a really good question. By the way, I mean, I feel pretty much the same way. You told me about your college ball experiences. It sounds like you were the only white black knight for a while, which is pretty cool.
That's right.
But I had a similar experience. I mean, I was an athlete in high school, although not into college. I mean, I'm 5'10", generously. Although as our program said in high school, 6'2" was also an option, but
right.
Besides that, I mean, same thing. I grew up in a big city. I'm from Chicago. I moved to nearby Aurora, which has, 400,000 people. So big city experience. And we had, white kids, Italian and Irish American kids, Hispanics, African Americans, whatever. We all got along. We all dated. We all played ball together. I don't want to exaggerate, high school athletic experiences. My best sport was actually running fast for the track team. But I mean, it was an enjoyable kind of urban experience, and race didn't seem very relevant. And you're right, a lot of the hip hop at the time, there was actually a song by Wu-Tang called "Where the White Women At." It wasn't something that people obsessed about unless you were talking to a friend's dad and hearing about the older days. And it does seem like we're swinging a little back toward identity. To answer your question, I mean, I think that originally began, the reason this was tolerated from black and Hispanic kids on college campuses is that it was seen as linked to the civil rights movement. So there are racial double standards in the USA, and that's not always necessarily unhealthy. But one of them is that minorities, because there are fewer of us, can advocate for our identity. So there's always been a Hispanic student union, and as long as that's, well-kept, smaller building on campus, no one's really cared. I think that the issue is that over the past 15 years, the number of identity groups has really expanded.
Right.
So we've seen large-scale immigration, so that even as whites are now a minority in most cities, you're still not supposed to advocate for whiteness, whereas you can now advocate not just for blackness, but for, thinking of my University of Illinois, a Chinese American identity, a Thai identity, an East Indian identity, Nigerian identity. And all the groups I mentioned make more money than whites, by the way. So I wouldn't be surprised if a working-class Irish kid is a little irritated by this by the end. But even from there, we've expanded into sexual rights. So, there are now trans student unions, gay student unions, and sometimes bluntly, this is just me thinking, it seems like a lot of middle-class white kids are trying to get themselves some kind of oppressed identity through this stuff.
Right.
So if you are Caucasian, but you also happen to be, for example, transgender, or now you see fat rights, you're a religious minority, so on down the line, then you too can claim that sense of victimhood that often correlates with money. Your question was, how long before just regular white kids that are playing some ball start identifying as white? We're seeing that already. You mentioned Jared Taylor, Richard Spencer. These guys, are clowns to some extent if you look at some of the things that certainly Spencer argues, but have million-person followings online.
Right.
I've debated Jared Taylor, as you know. He's a personable guy in person. You can see why people like him despite what he's saying. And what he's saying isn't, KKK, wave the burning torch stuff. It's literally what you just said in terms of, well, they can do it. Why can't we? So the alt-right, to some extent, I once said the alt-right is just the worst excesses of the social justice movement for broke white dudes. And that's pretty much right. It's almost a mirror image. Instead of the African flag, you have the Kekistani one. You have a bunch of sort of fictional reifying of being white as opposed to talking about Wakanda or, the glories of lost Africa. So, to some extent, to move away from that, you need to get back to where we were, where people work out together and date one another's cousins and don't think that much about race. Right now, I do think you're seeing that current start rising again in society. But right now, the dominant point of view seems to be, let's talk a lot about my lived experience, where I come from. And that can be really negative at the extremes.
Yeah, those lived experiences, for someone who is this is a Christian radio station. It's pretty evangelical, so Christians in a Southern evangelical tradition tend to shy away from subjectivity and try and want to remain with objective truth, seeking it, defining it, kind of keeping it out there in front to sort of protect any slippery slope activity. What seems really weird is that right now within even theological circles, you have not liberal theology in the sense of it being unorthodox, but like progressive Christianity has sort of adopted this critical race theory where every single person and their lived experience gets a special filter into the text by which they can interpret and share their insight, basically rendering this objective truth of the text, that being the Bible, pretty much non-existent anymore. That's another place where I see like really difficult times where if a church on a 4th of July weekend decides to do one extra prayer for the nation or put a picture of the American flag up, you have minority people in that church who see the flag as the symbol of oppression right now and immediately begin to question, why are we putting up this symbol of racism and oppression? That's a really weird space to be in. Our guest right now is Dr. WILFRED Reilly, assistant professor of political science at Kentucky State University. WILFRED, do you agree with people like Shelby Steele? I want to kind of pivot away from some things for a second, kind of talk a little bit more empirically. I depend on people like yourself, like Dr. Thomas Sowell, Walter Williams, the work that you guys do, having access to and knowing how to get through the data. So I want to kind of go right now. There's there's almost like a secondary or a racial comorbidity that we're seeing right now with BLM, and that's like the to use John McWhorter's language, the Ken D'Angelo-isms of like white fragility and white privilege and all this going on. How do there are people I know people right now, white people that are just all up in D'Angelo's book. They're taking the classes, they're discussing it, they're having their struggle sessions and all this, but they don't identify with the Marxist BLM organization, and for them, the phrase Black Lives Matter is self-evident, as I think to most people. But they are looking at their own racism, working through D'Angelo's work, and I feel like they're gonna just naturally, like a vacuum, get sucked into and be this useful idiot army for the BLM movement, which is only going to increase their numbers, increase their power, increase their ability and their influence. Is there any way to engage, just any thoughtful way to engage these people and separate out the Marxism and ultimately the desire to overthrow or to deconstruct the American governmental system of freedom and liberty and all that stuff that comes with it, and just separating them from this pseudo-scientific book of D'Angelo's?
I mean, there's a lot there. That's a good question. I mean, first of all, just bluntly for your white and other listeners, I don't think as an academic there's a whole hell of a lot to be gained from reading Robin DiAngelo or Ibram Kennedy or whatever. I mean, you know, there's a joking Chappelle Show episode where Chappelle and Wayne Brady pat each other on the back and say, "Black actors, I got your back, buddy." And to some extent, that's how I feel about other academics. Like, I don't hate on another man's success. If you wrote a book that sold 1 million copies, you know, good. I want to get there too. But in terms of just the actual logic and facts of, I mean, those particular authors, I don't really see a whole hell of a lot there. I mean, at one point, Kendi, for example, in his book says, well, the only two options when you see differences in terms of how two groups perform are that the one group is inferior to the other, or that they're dealing with, two, a racist system. And he says, well, I favor two. Every system is racist, so we've got to close every gap that exists in testing and criminal justice and so on. And the obvious response from any competent academic is no, there's a third option, which is that some variable, as we say, differs between the two groups. So if you look at black and white incomes, black people make about 85% as much as whites do. And that's very, very often attributed to racism. And racism probably plays some role. But I can't help noticing that that gap goes away entirely if you adjust for age. The average black man is 26 or 27. If you're looking at the mode, the average white man's 58. Region, more black people live in the South. We don't make dramatically less than whites in the South, but all wages are lower in Louisiana or Mississippi or Arkansas than they are in Manhattan.
Right.
Test scores play a role. So if you adjust for all that stuff, the gap closes, and that's something that kind of the pundits of race never discuss. So I don't think there's a ton of value there. When you ask, does reading that stuff constantly, you know, America is an evil nation, educational testing is racist, hiring is racist, does that move people toward socialist or communist, you know, left-wing politics? Yeah, it can. Another thing also, thinking back to college white women I've dated or been friends with, it also can cause an extreme backlash when you get tired of being yelled at. And that's where people really feed into the alt-right to some extent.
Right.
The alt-right isn't regular working-class kids who occasionally say naughty words. Those people tend to have a ton of black and Hispanic buddies from the army or the job site or whatever. It's sort of internet kids. It's disaffected people who were social justice warriors, went to the local college, got tired of this crap, and actually Googled the statistics around interracial crime or something like that and got radicalized. Like, that's 100% every alt-righter I've ever talked to or debated. So, yeah, I mean, there's the risk of falling into kind of a Marxist politics, and there's also the risk of moving toward that far right, just saying, you know, bleep this. I'm tired of being yelled at because of the color of my skin. I think that and both those are bad. And I think that the obvious response when you mention Shelby Steele or Thomas Sowell is just to kind of use facts and talk to people. So I'm extremely skeptical of the idea of lived experiences. That different, in fact, I don't think it's real. Like when you say different people have dramatically different reactions to, say, the words of Christ or to math problems, I don't find that to be true. I think if you gave the equation 2 + 2 = 4, or, you know, the instruction love thy neighbor to 100 people across racial lines, they would all understand that in pretty much the same way. there's really very little evidence for the idea that blacks, whites, and Asians think differently. I mean, that's a classic racist idea when you think about it.
Right.
There's no difference between something a neo-Nazi would say and some of the stuff that Robin DiAngelo says, for example. Like, we just can't understand. I'm not comparing the two, obviously, but like the idea that we can't understand what people are going through across racial lines. I mean, I would ask an intelligent white guy in your audience, why wouldn't you be able to understand that your black buddy has your life plus racism plus affirmative action? You can't know someone exactly, but I mean, you can understand the quote-unquote female mind well enough to plan anniversaries with your wife. You can understand the quote-unquote foreign personality well enough to make business deals with Germany or Japan and the USA. I'm not sure at all why the same thing wouldn't extend across racial lines. But the response to all this, I guess, would just be use facts. I've had a lot of success just talking to people and almost de-radicalizing people on the right and the left just by pointing out what the actual statistics are, being calm, having a beer while we're doing it. If people feel, for example, that racism is worse than it ever was in the U.S., I mean, you can compare that to past history. I mean, do you actually feel that racism is worse than it was during the Civil Rights Movement or the rise of the Muslim Brothers in the early 70s or World War II? I mean, is that a thing you believe? And people tend to get back to common sense pretty quickly. Again, and that the actual percentage of people that test as bigots is under a tenth for either blacks or whites. So you can, to some extent, point that out, and I feel people are pretty responsive to it. And there's not really that much factual underpinning for a lot of what Dr. Kendi, for example, says. So that's something people should point out to their friends, black and white and everything else.
I think that's one of the main reasons why, if you're listening to this and you agree with what our guest today, Dr. Wilfred Reilly, just said, you have to go, for your own sake, you have to go pick up Taboo, 10 Facts You Can't Talk About, because the way he laid out this book in basically chapters with overarching facts, you're going to hear, if you're on social media, if you're talking to people face to face, which is probably way more important than interacting with people on Twitter or Facebook back and forth, you have to pick this up because the first two chapters of his book deal with the narrative of like the war on police and the race wars that are existing there, and he lays out those facts. I want you to kind of speak on something that you wrote in chapter 3. Taboo, obvious fact number 3, different groups perform differently. That seems like a duh to like normal thinking people. But like, can you unpack that a little bit? Explain how different groups perform differently, yes, but why it isn't because of racism.
Yeah, I mean, so there are a couple things there. I mean, first, obviously, thanks for the book plug. Taboo is designed, the whole point of the book Taboo, it's structured around 10 chapters, and it's designed to empirically, to factually look at the things that blacks, whites, left, hard right, all these groups that are prominent in the media right now say, and unpack whether or not they're true. And a lot of them just aren't. So like chapter 1 looks at the claim that there's kind of a shooting war going on between police and young black men. And I actually find that, again, total number of unarmed black men killed by cops in a typical year, about 15. I also find there's no epidemic of cops being shot by young black men. I mean, that's under 50 in a typical year. There are about 35 million encounters with police every year, and the majority of those are just hardworking cops doing their job. So I point all this out. I have a chapter on interracial crime, so on down the line, chapter on immigration, blah, 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 critique the alt-right in the final chapter. But, I mean, what you pointed out is probably the most important chapter of the book because it actually takes on the idea of systemic or implicit prejudice. Not saying there's never any, but again, the argument there is the Ibram Kendi argument that if there are gaps in performance, that has to be because there's racism in the system unless you're a racist, i.e., you could be arguing that some people are genetically inferior to others. The SAT gap is due to minorities just not having the capability to take tests. And I obviously don't feel that because I'm not a racist. But what I say is that there's obviously a third possibility, which is that there are these different variables that vary between groups that predict performance, that predict what people are going to do. So in chapter 3, for example, I look at one of the gaps Kendi talks about constantly, the new Jim Crow talks about, Robin DiAngelo talks about, and that's the gap in kind of interactions with the criminal justice system. Black people are 2.6, I believe, times more likely to be arrested than white people are. And what I point out is that the reason for that is obviously that there's a difference in crime rate. And there's not just a difference in crime rate between racial groups. I mean, if you want to argue the criminal justice system is racist, you'd also have to argue that it's sexist. I mean, men are 8 to 10 times as likely to be arrested for most crimes, robbery, rape, as women are. So these differences exist. And right now in the United States of America, if you look at what's called the Bureau of Justice Statistics, BJS annual report, the black crime rate as reported by victims, not by potentially crooked cops, is 2.4 times the white crime rate. So if you adjust just for the rate at which people are reported to commit crimes, the gap in arrests almost totally vanishes. Like 2.6 is bigger than 2.4, so there might be some racism at the margins, or that might just be the effect of more brothers living in cities. But many, many, many times, when you take on these large gaps that radical activists always attribute to racism or to the great racists fighting one another, and you adjust for something as basic as age, which is probably why there's a higher African-American crime rate, age and poverty, the gap vanishes, the gap disappears. So that chapter just points out that you have to adjust for differences between groups before you attribute these quote-unquote performance gaps to racism. And the second point, differences between groups exist in terms of almost everything. I mean, different races get different standardized test scores, for example, which ties into college admissions and all the stuff we were talking about. And again, that's not genetic, and I explain why it's not, but there's certainly a huge cultural element. It's not because the test is racist. The group that does best on all standardized exams is Asian Americans because they study an hour more per day on average than white or black Americans.
Right.
So I just point out things like this.
Taboo,
Rate,
10
test
facts.
Scores.
Go ahead, sorry.
No, sorry. I think I cut you off, actually. But I mean, they're just, the chapter looks at like 5 or 6 different things, like measured crime rates, standardized test scores. I throw in IQ scores briefly, area people choose to live. I mean, you have some advantages if you live in a huge city, black or white, as opposed to a small whistle-stop town. But all those things vary between groups. It doesn't make any sense to say, there are more Hispanic players in MLB than Japanese players. The league's racist until you first adjust for how often people play baseball.
And isn't when we hear these stats given by the media or by the grievance industry, like we never hear about the crime rate when you talk about incarceration, arrests, or victimhood, or whatever. Like we never hear about the difference in the actual, like who's actually committing the crime. Like if you have a lot more police presence in your neighborhood, could it be that they're doing their job, attempting to protect innocent people because there's more crime there? Like, I don't want all the police hanging out in an area that statistically hardly any to no crime is committed. I want where the crime is committed and the police there protecting the people who ultimately become the victims of those criminals. I mean, is that crazy?
Careful with those facts now, man. No, but I mean, banter aside, of course that's true. I mean, obviously there are more police in inner city black neighborhoods and poor white neighborhoods like trailer parks because there's more crime there. I mean, basically the entire activist argument on this is as simplistic as it sounds. And again, I don't want to mock, well-intentioned scholars that are moving some units, but essentially every one of these books, like the new Jim Crow, for example, which isn't a badly written book and which I assigned to my very first freshman class of students because there are some points in there. But the new Jim Crow basically just looks at a bunch of gaps between blacks and whites and says racism. The obvious fact is that although racism in the past may have something to do with things like the higher crime rate, I think it does myself, the reason that today, in 2020, in a mostly anti-racist society, there are more arrests in black neighborhoods is not just that the cops decided to go down there and piss off black people.
Right.
It's that there's more crime in the neighborhood. This is just as true for poor whites. I mean, when I think of some of the cities I've been to, Mississippi, Louisiana, this is just as true for young Hispanic immigrants. You're going to see almost as many cops in those neighborhoods, if not just as many, because of the high crime rate. I mean, so yeah, once again, adjusting for basic things like what the crime rate is totally explains the higher percentage of police in African-American neighborhoods. It totally explains the higher percentage of arrests. One thing I want to say, because I teach some criminal justice as well as some political science at Kentucky State University, since like the 1980s, most competent police departments have used what's called the comp stat model of policing, where you try to minimize any bias officers might have, which actually led to them spending more time in the suburbs, hitting on housewives and taking cats out of trees than you would want them to do. So you assign police to areas based on basically computer models. Like you run a computer program that tells you where there are shootings, for example, in a city, where there are people with outstanding warrants, where there's been, for example, a spike in robberies, and you flood that area with officers that do things like stop and frisk, pat down searches, so on. So in almost any city, the number of cops that you have in an area is going to be a direct response to how much crime there was in that area over the past month. Like the police, unless you're talking about the chief or something like that, or a senior captain, don't really have much choice in where they go. So yeah, it's just silly to say that because there are more arrests in an area, the police must be racist or something like that. The very first question should be, well, what's going on in that area?
Right.
I mean, I would assume there's some very high crime areas of New Orleans. We talk about, Cash Money saying about the Magnolia Projects back in the day. I mean, the equivalent still exists.
Right.
And those areas are going to have more cops, and they're going to be low crime areas with few cops.
That CompStat program that you referred to, has it shown to be effective?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, so again, I think everyone, specifically every city kid, and we both have that legitimate background, hates crooked cops. I mean, thinking of everything from, playing basketball in working class black areas to going to punk shows. I mean, I've been harassed by the police, been called things that weren't acceptable. They're not really racial things. You can MF anybody. But by and large, we have seen sort of a competent, improved policing since the 1960s. I mean, and you can tell this just by looking at the crime data. So in the USA, I mean, there was an enormous spike in crime between, 1965 and 1993. And that, again, doesn't have much to do with the ethnic conflict on either side or anything like that. It has to do with specific changes that were made in the law. So you saw the Miranda case where you have to be read your full list of rights before you're taken in by the police. And at least that one I support. But then you saw the Escobedo case, which dealt with this scumbag rapist and dramatically extended the rights provided by Miranda. You saw what's called fruit of the poison tree, where if the police find something during a search where the officer does anything illegal at all, he's no longer fired or punished, which used to be the standard. Instead, that evidence is thrown out and the criminal goes free. You saw Gideon V. Wainwright just a few years before. You get a free, pretty well-qualified court-appointed lawyer. And so after all that, in the period between, say, as I said, 65 and 93, crime increased about 500%. And the response to that was the modern techniques in policing that we're talking about. Like, no one pulled back those civil rights, but police departments started using CompStat. They started using stop and frisk. They started using targeted policing, where you identify who the goons in a neighborhood probably are and go after them. Computer records of past crimes in the area. And as all that happened, and they also just put more cops on the street. But as that sort of Giuliani, it's called CompStat policing, broken windows policing, as that occurred, I mean, between the mid-90s and today, we've seen crime drop by 2/3. I mean, the number of robberies, for example, in New York City is down 80% from its peak. New York City used to see, and as a Chicagoan, we almost had a dark competition with them. But I mean, New York City used to see 1,500, 2,000 murders a year. And last year, I believe they saw 239. So yeah, that increased policing, where you take competent officers with the associate's degree and the computer in the car, and you put them in high crime areas, that has had a dramatic effect on crime. And what you're going to see almost certainly, if you go back to old school reactive sit in the station house policing, is that crime's going to increase. And we're already seeing that now in cities that are doing this. I mean, you see these unfortunate but almost darkly funny headlines coming out of New York and Chicago. De Blasio disbanded the city's entire elite crime task force. And, I mean, the other day reading Bloomberg, getting ready for a business meeting, I saw that crime was up 205% in the areas where those guys used to operate. So, again, more cops probably means less crime. Everything else being equal.
Right. Wilfred, we want to definitely have you down the road. Come back and do another time with us. Just love talking to you. Love the way you lay out the facts. Thank you for what you do. One last question before we let you go.
Sure.
I'd like you to pull out your sort of political science crystal ball, rub your hands on it, get it all nice and smoky. President in November, is Donald Trump reelected, or do we have President Joe Biden, in your opinion?
Man, it's going to be a tough one. I would have said, up until COVID-19, I would have said, yeah, Trump is going to get reelected. I mean, he has his problems, big, brash, stereotypical Republican guy, long red tie. He's said some things that I would take back if I were him. But the economy was booming. You had black unemployment at its lowest rate ever, female unemployment. And then, I mean, a disease pandemic hit. I don't think he handled it particularly badly. I mean, if you look at the USA, we've lost 136,000 to COVID. But if you look at the Eurozone, which is the same size, plus or minus 8 million people, and they've lost 195,000. So that's something that's not really mentioned in the mainstream media coverage of this. But, nonetheless, the disease pandemic, riots in the streets, President Trump really didn't do all that much about the riots. He was tweeting things like law and order. I mean, local governors were openly refusing that offer of National Guardsmen. And I mean, right now, Biden's up 10, 12 points in the polls. The problem with that, though, is that Joe Biden, I mean, Ben Shapiro, the conservative commentator, jokingly says Joe Biden's been dead for a year.
Right.
I mean,
like Weekend at Bernie's.
Yeah, he's not out there giving speeches. He's literally in his basement because he's so high risk for COVID. So he's not really doing anything either. I mean, he's not jumping out and seizing that flag. Right now, I'd say it's looking like Biden's probably going to win. But I wouldn't put more than 60% on that. I mean, we saw what happened to the polls last time.
Yeah, no doubt. Dr. Reilly, thank you so much. Appreciate the time with you. Again, the book is Taboo, 10 Facts You Can't Talk About. Go out and get it today. Thank you. We'd love to have you back again. You have a great day.
Sure, you too. I'd love to come back. Bye.
Thank you very much. Man, I tell you what, you have to be able to find people like Wilfred, like some of those other people that we talked about. You have to be able to find them to be able. They handle data. They're trained to go through, to sift through, like finding gold and finding those nuggets. That book is definitely one that will do it for you. Hate, Crime, Hoax is the other book. Pick it up as well. And I promise you, not only will you be blessed by it, because you'll be encouraged. Like with everything we hear and all the negativity that we hear out there, you'll be encouraged to know that things are not necessarily what you see on social media, not necessarily what you see coming out of legacy media. Things are a lot better, and you'll hopefully be encouraged. So be encouraged with that.